Revelations over the past year that one Ontario inmate, Adam Capay, had spent more than 4 years in solitary confinement, helped prompt the government at Queen's Park to re-examine what this province has been doing behind bars. They called on someone with unparalleled experience on this issue, former federal correctional investigator Howard Sapers, to examine the system and recommend reforms. He is now the independent advisor to the Government of Ontario on correction reform, and it brings Howard Sapers back to our studio tonight. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure.
Let's just do a few bullet points off the top here to give people a sense of the way things are out there. Sheldon, if you would, bring up this graphic. There are 26 provincial adult correctional facilities in the province of Ontario, housing around 8,000 inmates, and the facilities they are held in, more than half of them are more than 40 years old. 3 of them were built, if you can believe this, in the 1800s, and Brockville's jail is the oldest one at 175 years old. With that background in place, let's just find out what the Ontario government tasked you with doing.
Well, the first task was to take a deep look into segregation. And what Ontario asked me to do was to, first of all, see what the picture looked like, describe it, provide them some comment and recommendations on how to reduce the use of segregation, how to improve the conditions of confinement for those who are segregated, and then really to improve accountability and transparency around that whole process, who goes into segregation, how long they stay, for what reasons they're there, and how do they get out.
Just so we're clear on this, because I think everybody normally calls it solitary confinement, but you prefer the term segregation to mean what exactly?
Well, segregation is the legal term. So it's what we see in Canadian legislation. It's what we see in Canadian policy. So I'm very comfortable using the term segregation, popularly isolation, the whole solitary. In Ontario, what that means being in a very small room, perhaps 5 meters square, 6 by 9 feet, for 23 to 24 hours a day in some cases, sometimes for days on end. It means being confined in that cell, very little human interaction, very little stimulation, very little opportunity to do much of anything but sit in a cell, and sometimes with no control over the lights, no fresh air, no access to even natural light.
Well, let's put up some of the information that you have shared with us so that we understand more about what segregation in the province of Ontario means. And yes, let's do board 3 first here, Sheldon. On any given day in the year 2016, about 575 inmates were in segregation in the province. That's about 7% of the prison population. Last year, more than 1,300 men and women spent 60 or more aggregate days in a segregation cell. Those with mental health and or suicide risks spent nearly 30% more time in segregation than the rest of the segregated population. And Indigenous people make up 2% of our province's population, but were 14% of those admitted to custody and segregation in the year 2016. And let's also do now, shall we follow up with, let's follow up now with Board 2 on the independent advisor's key recommendations. Here's what you've had to say. You want a 15-day limit on placements in solitary confinement and up to 60 cumulative days in any 365-day period. You want a prohibition on the use of solitary confinement for inmates who are suicidal or diagnosed with significant mental illness, medical conditions, or pregnant. The appointment of independent officers to oversee solitary confinement placements. You want the renovation or reconstruction of a few facilities here: Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre, Toronto South Detention Centre, and the Thunder Bay Jail. Providing segregated inmates with better access to reading material, radios, and televisions. And let's do one more graphic here while we can. Okay, Sheldon, let's go to graphic 1 here and talk about, why is this a big issue? It's a big issue because segregation is on the rise in the province of Ontario. The turquoise bar are female inmates. The orange bars are male inmates. And one can see from this graph, you look at the top line, it's starting to go north, right? So as the years have gone by, the numbers of people in segregation is on the rise. Okay, Howard, lots to unpack here. Why don't we start with just that last chart? Why is the number rising over the years?
Well, in some ways, that was what I was asked to try to address. What's really interesting is that segregation use in Ontario has gone up every year for the last 10 years. And over that same decade, the actual daily count, so all of those people in custody in Ontario, has gone down. So as a proportion, we're using the most restricted form of custody for more people as our crime rate has been dropping and as our total custody count has been dropping. So there's something going on that's specific to segregation. For many people, they've said it's the increase in the proportion of people who are in conflict with the law who actually also have some mental health issues. And the lack of the readiness of Ontario Corrections to really deal with that population.
Do I infer from that you think they ought not to be in segregation if they're suffering from mental health issues?
The recommendation is pretty clear that if you have a diagnosis of a serious mental illness, you should not be segregated. It's dangerous. It's also very difficult for staff. And remember, most of these recommendations that are about institutional operations, the conditions of confinement are also the conditions of work for people. And so you really have to keep that in mind as well.
I got some numbers here on this as well, obviously from your report. Between 2015 and 2016, the share of cells occupied by prisoners with mental health issues, this is segregation cells, rose from 32% to 45% over one calendar year. Again, what's going on in our prisons to warrant that kind of uptick?
Well, the question is really a little bit more upstream. Why is it that these people are being sent to custody? So this talks about the decisions made by police, decisions made by Crown prosecutors, decisions made by courts, that these folks are ending up. And so part of the remedy is really looking at options and off-ramps and alternatives at that part of the process. But my focus was really on corrections. So once these individuals are in custody, and corrections doesn't get to pick and choose who comes through the door, what can corrections do? So that has to do, as I said, with conditions of confinement, better screening, better testing, better array of resources, more alternatives, all aimed towards trying to keep the segregation count down.
But this is clearly a problem that will more easily be solved if you can solve it upstream as opposed to downstream.
Absolutely.
Okay. Just a word here on you mentioned Ottawa Carleton, Toronto South, and Thunder Bay. Those three facilities warranted special mention in your report. What is particularly egregious about what's going on in those places?
Well, let me be clear. I had 60 days to compile this report. Now, I visited about half of the institutions in Ontario. I have the other half to go. There may be an addendum coming to that.
So we shouldn't assume these are the only problem places.
Those are not the only problem places.
But in particular, what's wrong with them?
So the Thunder Bay Jail just is some of the worst conditions that I've seen, and very bad in terms of the people that work there. Very inadequate facility for its task. Toronto South is the other end of the spectrum. It's one of the newest jails. It's big, it's modern, it's got lots of technology, but it has some operational design issues as well. And so the recommendations about Toronto South were really, look, there are some deficiencies that have been already identified. Get on with fixing those deficiencies, and then think about the best way to utilize that facility. And maybe some things have changed since when it was designed a decade ago. Maybe there's a few things that have changed about how you want to use that space. Ottawa Carleton, I don't think anybody needs any more information about OCDC. It has significant operational challenges because of its design and all the renovation. I think it's safe to say a lot of that has been haphazard, and it needs to be addressed.
Okay. Sheldon, let's do graphic 2 now. And if you would, Howard, take us through this graphic, because you've got a pie chart here which explains all the reasons why inmates are in segregation. And let's start in the top right corner. Inmate protection is the biggest chunk of people. And you want to just sort of briefly take us around the pie chart here and explain why things are the way they are?
Well, sure. So these are the official reasons why people might be in a segregation cell. And so protective custody or inmate protection, you see that's 24%. But what's really interesting is if you go to the next triangle, which is the 16% that says inmate protection medical. So these are typically people that don't pose a security risk. Segregation is not being used for the worst of the worst or the most dangerous, sometimes just the most difficult to manage, or those that they just don't feel they have safe alternatives for. So these are people that are ill, that maybe should be in infirmaries or hospitals, but they're being medically managed in the most maximum security part of the most maximum security jails. These are not therapeutic spaces. They can't be. They're not designed to be.
And therefore not helpful to better outcomes.
Not at all. And so as you go around that chart, what you see is that it also exposes, I think, some of the mythology around segregation. You know, the minority of people are there because they choose to be.
Well, it says here 7% inmate request.
Yeah.
Why might an inmate want to be in solitary?
Typically because they're afraid, typically. And so that feeds back into the question about protection. Also, you know, a lot of people say, well, we need lots of segregation because we have to discipline. We need it to control the institution.
That's only 3%.
Yeah, very small proportion. Most segregation is discretionary, and it's called administrative, and it's because of decisions by the administration of the jail.
Let's understand that. Does it have to go all the way up to the top before someone goes into segregation, or kind of guard it down the food chain, as you like, make that call?
Correctional officers can certainly move people into segregation. They can charge people with disciplinary infractions. There is a segregation review process. It's not entirely the Wild West. There is a process, but the degree to which that process is respected, and the degree to which that process then changes behavior, is questionable. And a lot of the recommendations I've made are really trying to make that oversight and accountability much more robust. And also to provide other options. So it's not just segregation or general population. There may be some other things we can do for those who need infirmary support or mental health support, etc.
Let's show what it looks like.
Sure.
Go ahead, Sheldon. This is image 1. Okay, that's your classic, as we would say in the old imperial measurement, 6 by 9, I guess 2 meters by 3 meters now that we're in metric. Do you want to just give us a guided tour of?
Well, sure. So that's a pretty typical modern segregation cell, and in my experience in going through Ontario corrections, it's rather remarkable because it actually had a window to the outside. You could actually get some natural light. That's not present in many or even most of the cells that I've seen. This is a segregation cell in Thunder Bay Correctional Center. So
doesn't look like they've got a window.
No window, no fresh air. Very little access to open space. So in front of that is a small corridor. So even when you're out of your cell, you may just be in a slightly bigger cage outside of your cell.
And typically you're in that room how many hours a day?
Well, the policy right now would call for you being confined to that space for 22 hours a day. But during our investigation, what we found is that people weren't always given that time out of cell. And we spoke to many individuals who had been in their segregation cells for days on end without
ever getting out.
Without leaving them. Yeah.
What are the emotional / intellectual / health implications of doing that?
Well, you know, there's research on that question, and the research provides some mixed answers. But the general consensus is that it is soul destroying. People begin to hallucinate.
At what point?
It varies, and that's why the research is a little inconclusive, because it changes. It changes based on your own strengths, your own personal history. Did you have pre-existing mental health conditions before you were segregated? How many times you've been segregated? Do you know when you're going to be released? One of the most debilitating things about segregation is that it can be continuous. If you're segregated for a disciplinary infraction, and you're told as a punishment, you're going to be in segregation for 5 days, that is not as harmful to you as if you were put in administratively. And you know that that can go on forever, and you never know when you're going to be released.
So that light at the end of the tunnel means everything.
Absolutely.
You did put a deadline on this, though. You did say nobody should be in segregation for more than 15 straight days, and that ought to be a hard cap.
Yeah.
How'd you come up with that number?
Well, there's some international consensus around that number now. There was a UN special report on solitary confinement, and the special rapporteur recommended that 15 days, anything more than 15 days consecutive, should be considered cruel and unusual punishment. There's other rules that are existing around the world. There's the United Nations standard minimum rules called the Mandela rules that talk about caps. There's the European Union has rules around caps. Many of the US state jurisdictions are looking at 15 days now as a standard. So we didn't just pick it out of the air. There seems to be some consensus around that. And it does speak to the necessity for the system to really focus its efforts on doing what the law already tells them they should be doing, which is relying on segregation as an exceptional measure, not a default measure for difficult behavior.
I appreciate that you're only 6 months into a potential 3-year term doing this mission for the Ontario government. So I don't know how many people you've talked to so far, but I'm going to assume you talked to prison guards for this report, prison administrators, people in solitary?
Yeah.
You talk to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Enough to get a good sense about how this has an impact on them?
Well, certainly, and I bring into this role a little bit of awareness about that. I've been spending a lot of time in jail most of my adult life, and I've spoken to many.
That's funny. We should just clarify for professional reasons, as opposed to breaking the law.
And you certainly have focused on segregation while I was correctional investigator for Canada as well. But you know what's interesting? No matter whether I'm talking to a deputy minister or a on-call correctional officer or somebody that's been in and out of the system as a correctional client for years, nobody is defending the status quo. Everybody is saying, yes, this must change, things can be better, we know how to do it better. Many of the things in my report, frankly, weren't news to the government of Ontario and to the people that manage the correction system. Many people have been calling for many reforms for years.
Well, let me pursue that with you, because I do wonder how things got so off track so badly. You've got a quote in your report saying, "We probably track livestock better than we do human beings." How did this, I mean, the Adam Capay situation in Thunder Bay, I guess shone a light on this in a dramatic way for the first time in many, many years, which prompted the Ontario government to act and get you involved and so on. But how did it get so off track, do you suppose?
Yeah, well, that quote actually
from the Ombudsman's report.
Was from the Ombudsman's report, yeah. And that's interesting, because there was an Ontario Ombuds look at this issue in parallel with my work. So it's a combination of things. It didn't happen overnight. The system was literally starved for resources. So you have to put that on the table squarely. There was not a lot of investment. There was an attitude shift. Corrections has fads. There was an attitude shift about what the purpose of Ontario jail should be, and that purpose shied away from what has always been considered in Canada to be the second pillar. Security and custody for sure, but reintegration, rehabilitation as well. It was that second pillar that was really minimized for a couple of decades in Ontario, and so things did get off balance. And when things get off balance, this is the kind of result you get. It's still an intensely human business. You have to make sure that the men and women who are working inside those jails are properly equipped, properly trained, properly supervised. You have the resources they need to do their jobs, and you have to make sure that the infrastructure is also suitable. Small but important things. The age profile of people in custody is changing. So a jail that was built 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago was not built for wheelchairs, hospital beds, walkers. So we have to address that, because the demographics of our country are changing.
Prisoners are getting older too?
Absolutely.
Okay, I hear this question asked a lot of the time. In our remaining moments here, let's take this on. Adam Capay was in solitary because he killed somebody. And I guess people want to know, okay, if solitary is not a good option, what's a better option?
Well, for Adam Capay was in solitary confinement or in a segregation cell in a remand center because he was accused. And so that's a very important
of killing
piece.
A fellow prisoner.
He was accused. And so part of corrections' job is to make sure people are available for their trial, and the rest of the system is in place to make sure that that trial is delivered consistent with the law.
That's a good distinction. I should not have convicted him there. He was accused.
So Mr. Capay, now we know a lot about him, and we know that there were difficulties in terms of retaining and instructing counsel, having assessments done, fitness questions, and so, again, many, many questions that go well beyond the role of corrections. Why has it taken so long to get this man to trial? What are the issues around legal counsel? What about the bail process and the criminal code mandated bail reviews that were supposed to happen? What were the outcome of those reviews? So there's lots of questions about why it was there. Now the alternatives would really flow from the answer to those questions. If, and this is an if, and it's not just for Mr. Capay, but for anybody, if he is mentally ill, what kind of support for his illness should we provide?
You know that he is or isn't?
It's really nothing that I can comment on. But if somebody is mentally ill and they need medical intervention, then they should have that medical intervention. If it's a fitness issue, then we should address that fitness issue. I think everybody can agree that having somebody in a plexiglass-lined cell with a light on 24 hours a day, with very little human interaction for 4 years is not contrary to the proper administration of justice.
We are going to have some follow-up discussion on your report, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight and setting the table for that. We know that you are not finished your mission. No. You have another report still to do, and I'm sure we'll have you back here when you've come up with your next set of recommendations. Howard Sapers, the independent advisor to the Government of Ontario on corrections reform. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.